Hello everyone, Amani Kashera here. I hope you have all been able to work through your online learning packages for week one. Now, in this second week of the course, we are really focusing on understanding social policy processes. But before doing that, we might want to focus on looking at social policy problem and why, in particular, some problems end up being regarded as social policy problems and others not. So, really speaking broadly, there is no universally accepted definition of social policy problems or social problems, even generally, but there is an increasing consensus that for something to be regarded as a social problem, it has to be undesirable or even harmful, and it can be a condition or a behavior which has an objective and even a subjective dimension. So these problems are socially and even contextually constructed. They must have social roots, but also you might want to consider how they affect significant number of people, or even a number of significant people, if you might want to consider that as well. But also, they might be social recognition and even a shared understanding of something as being a problem. And then there might be a possibility of an envisioned solution. And of course, usually this is often associated with the idea that something has to be done to address this problem, or there exists a solution to this problem, and a solution which is a social one, a solution that we can explain, not a metaphysical solution, but a solution which has, again, a social dimension. So also social problems really reflect underlying values. Conflict with underlying values, and even, systemic and structural values or conditions. So John Stuart Mill, who's one of the early scholars to theorize around, the understanding of social issues in the 19th century, highlighted really the systemic, ethical, and policy relevant concerns of social problems. That social problems are not only, individual failures. They must not be considered as just individual fates, but regarded mostly around this systemic dimension, or even the structural dimension of, social problems. And that in itself, of course, I think John Stuart Mill called for structural solutions to social issues. Now, clearly you can see that there are many competing agendas to the understanding of social problems. One of these understanding, or even if you might want to consider different ways in which social problems are understood, one of these might be looking at social problems as unmet needs. And in social work in particular, there is this understanding that unaddressed needs can ultimately lead to social problems. If you don't have access to food, you can end up, being in specific conditions which are regarded as problematic. If you can't have access to shelter and shelter-related needs not being addressed, that can lead to homelessness, which definitely we recognize as a social problem. So this understanding really focuses on, developing services which address problems. So another understanding really is coming from early scholars like Emile Durkheim, who sees social problems as, institutional failure or institutional inability to address, needs and problems even. And this again is at odds with this idea of looking at social problems as individual failures, rather looking at the institutions and how they fail to address, conditions leading to, social problems is a key idea from Durkheim. There is this whole idea of, social pathology, which again is an important one when it comes to looking at social problems as uh, institutional failures. But also this again might be at odds with people who just look at social problems from maybe the social deviance related theories. And again, you see this competition among scholars when they try to really find a shared understanding of social problems. So clearly speaking, you can see that social problems are not just given, they are made, they are shaped in a certain way. And Joel Best, for example, argues how the definitions of social problems, leads or frames what we end up seeing as the best possible solution of addressing that. So there is this question of legitimacy in how, social problems and, what is understood to be a social problem and the perceived solutions in terms of policies are negotiated and even objectively, these are not objectively fixed. So the question here now becomes, the question of urgency in terms of who defines a certain problem as a social policy problem. And that raises the question on how different problems get to be accepted as problems and even how they get to be, adopted on the social policy agenda and what kind of evidence often we need or evidence we really, uh, you know, need in place to define something as a problem and to take it on the agenda, and what kind of worldviews even are informing all these processes. So in week one, we spoke briefly about social policy as an attempt to solve problems. And clearly, as we define social problem, especially looking at social problems as a social construct, you can see that there is this moral and political imperative that, when we look at something and when something is already accepted as a problem, then the next question is what can be done to address it. So then the question of social policy as answers to social problems, is really translating in terms of values and, the course of actions which can be put in place to address those problems. But even other important questions like who gets what, when, how, and under what conditions, when we are doing social policy exactly, these are some of the considerations we are taking. And again, all these are informed by the values and belief systems and even the traditions we have in place. So the solution offered by social policy as a response to social problem often reflects deeper tensions between, what is regarded as welfare versus control. And we see this very often maybe in the child protection sector when decisions have to be made around, child removal or things like that. You can see these tensions happening, whether is it what we are doing, is it still welfare or are we trying to control families? And tensions even around equity and efficiency, tensions around inclusion and exclusion. So clearly, social policy is an alternative or even, a solution to social problems is a terrain of ongoing debates and even conflicts and tensions at times. So, but also social policy, as a response to social problems, draws on empirical knowledge to inform the analysis of social problems. And when we start speaking about, the different frameworks of social policy analysis, we shall try to see how in many of these models, the first and initial part of everything is trying to understand the problem or the issue at hand. And of course, the assessment of options. And you see this coming in the writings of key scholars like Eugène Bardac, whom we introduced in week one. So social policy are therefore based on assumptions about what might work in addressing what we have already identified as problems. And of course, social policy also uses analytical frameworks to understand how this knowledge can be used in a systematic and rigorous manner to make sure that we are not only fixing the problem, but at the same time doing it in the most ethical possible way. So this whole process, as you can see, is quite value-laden. It is politicized, as we said in week one, and it often may create its own problems. I really have to acknowledge this as much as we can, that, social policy as an attempt to solve problem doesn't come without problem itself. We have spoken a lot about policies which ended up creating more significant problems than the problems they were trying to address. And we really need to be very mindful of this as we approach and try to engage in policy practice. So then the question about who makes policy and whose responsibility is it trying to address social problems through social policy is an important question. And clearly in your textbook, you might have realized that it doesn't have to be just the preserve of the expert. McClelland et al., the main textbook for this course, put this in a very clear way that everyone can participate in policy practice broadly. So this applies really to a wide range of different actors and contexts, in addition to those designated policy positions. So it doesn't have to be just the professionals or people in the government policy sectors. It can be everyone. It can be you. It can be community members. It can be, individuals. Everyone has a responsibility when it comes to policy practice broadly and trying to address problems. So the social policy sector as a problem-solving process itself is a trial and error and even an iterative process where yes, expertise is needed, but the expertise which is needed in one aspect of policy practice might be different from the expertise which is needed at another stage. So again, this speaks to really how you don't always have to be an expert to engage in policy. And what I mean by policy here is not necessarily policy makers, but even policy, people who are involved in advocacy. They are still doing an important role. They are still playing an important role in policy making. And I suggested that this screenshot really from McClelland, which provides an overview of the different scopes of policy practice, again, trying to really illustrate how policy practice mostly is not only, the preserve of the experts, but everyone can be involved. And everyone is needed at some point.